There is something deeply unsettling about a man who enjoys watching his own torture scenes.
Why the need for so much gruesome, graphic violence? Why not let us imagine
Because it's so much fun, Chan. Get it?
And dances with excitement while directing brutal violence, transforming human suffering into entertainment. A straight razor slicing through an ear while the victim screams in agony. A Nazi skull being bashed in with a baseball bat. Slaves whipped and tortured for the amusement of audiences worldwide. All brought to you by Quentin Tarantino, the man Hollywood calls a genius. But after 30 years of watching him monetize brutality and normalize violence as art,
This blood scaring the shit out of me, Larry.
They call it Royale with cheese.
Our fun is so much fun.
one question haunts every blood-soaked frame. Are we celebrating a cinematic mastermind, or are we enabling the public expression of a deeply disturbed psyche? The answer lies in a pattern of obsession that becomes more disturbing the closer you look. It was 1992, and audiences were walking out of theaters in disgust. The film was Reservoir Dogs, and the scene that broke them was simple. A man tied to a chair, screaming, as another man danced around him before slicing off his ear with a straight razor. The camera didn't look away, but neither did Tarantino. Here was a 29-year-old filmmaker whose artistic vision centered on inflicting psychological discomfort on his audience, and Hollywood was about to make him very, very rich for it. But that ear-cutting scene was just a preview. Over the next 3 decades, Tarantino would build an empire on escalating brutality, each film pushing boundaries that previous generations of filmmakers wouldn't dare cross. The boy who dropped out of high school to watch violent movies in a video store had found his calling, turning human suffering into entertainment. What nobody realized then was that we weren't just watching the birth of a new cinematic voice. We were witnessing the first public expression of a mind that would spend the next 30 years exploring its darkest impulses on the world's biggest stages, with society's full approval and financial backing. To understand what drives Quentin Tarantino, you have to look at what excites him. Not what he claims inspires him, but what makes his eyes light up when he talks about his own work. In interview after interview, Tarantino becomes most animated when describing violence. His hands gesture wildly, his voice quickens, his entire body language changes. He's like reliving the pleasure. Compare that to how he discusses his characters' emotional journeys or dialogue. Competent, professional, but without that spark of genuine excitement. This pattern reveals itself across his entire filmography. Pulp Fiction gave us the gimp scene and accidental brain splattering that had audiences laughing at death. Kill Bill transformed the massacre of a wedding party into balletic entertainment. Django Unchained turned slavery's horrors into a revenge fantasy where torture becomes justice. But here's what's most disturbing. Tarantino doesn't just direct violence, he choreographs it. Every blood spatter is calculated, every scream is orchestrated, and every moment of agony is carefully crafted for maximum impact. The man who once worked at a video store, consuming endless hours of exploitation films and violent B-movies, learned that violence sells. But somewhere along the way, it became clear that for Tarantino, violence fulfills something deeper, something that critics and audiences have been uncomfortable naming for 30 years. Quentin Tarantino grew up watching his teenage mother cycle through relationships with different men. Some kind, others less so. He's described feeling powerless in a household where he had no control, where adult dysfunction surrounded him constantly. For a child in that environment, movies became more than escape. They became a place where he could control every outcome, where he could decide who lived, who died, and who suffered. Uma Thurman learned this the hard way during Kill Bill. When she expressed concerns about performing a dangerous driving stunt, Tarantino didn't listen. He convinced her the car was safe, that she was being overly cautious. The result was a crash that left her with permanent injuries to her neck and knees, with Tarantino later calling it the biggest regret of my life. This pattern of prioritizing his creative vision over human welfare extends throughout his career. Actors have described a director who becomes genuinely angry when his authority is questioned, who demands not just performance, but psychological submission to his worldview. But control on set is just the surface. The deeper issue is how Tarantino exercises control over his characters, and by extension, his audience. In his films, people don't just die. They suffer elaborately, beautifully, according to his precise specifications. He constructs scenarios where he can explore power, domination, and the infliction of pain without real-world consequences. There's a specific way Quentin Tarantino views women, and it's written across every frame of his films. Look at Uma Thurman's character in Kill Bill, where she's literally buried alive, tortured, left for dead. Also, she can emerge as an avenging angel. Kerry Washington in Django Unchained is brutalized to motivate the male protagonist's journey. Even when Tarantino creates supposedly strong female characters, their strength is defined entirely by their capacity for violence. The most disturbing aspect is how this pattern extends to his apparent fetishization of feet. In nearly every film, there are lingering, inexplicable shots of women's bare feet. When directly asked about this obsession, Tarantino becomes evasive, claiming it's not intentional, but the consistency across decades of filmmaking suggests otherwise. Tarantino has found a way to transform his private fixations into public entertainment, and that should terrify us more than any scene he's ever filmed. Perhaps nothing reveals Tarantino's psychological landscape more clearly than his relationship with racial violence and slurs. Django Unchained features the N-word over 100 times, and Tarantino, a white filmmaker, seems to take genuine pleasure in writing scenes where white characters use racial slurs with impunity. But here's what's truly disturbing. He's inserted himself into his own films to say these words. In Pulp Fiction, he appears as a character specifically so he can use racial slurs on screen. When questioned about this choice, his defensiveness is telling. This isn't about historical accuracy or artistic necessity. It's about a white man creating scenarios where he can explore racial dominance without consequences. Samuel L. Jackson, who has worked with Tarantino multiple times, once noted that the director seemed unusually comfortable with racial slurs, even during casual conversation. Other black actors have made similar observations, describing a filmmaker who approaches racial violence with an enthusiasm that feels personally motivated rather than artistically justified. The pattern becomes clear when you examine his films about race. They're not told from black perspectives, but filtered through Tarantino's psychological needs. Django Unchained and Jackie Brown appropriate black pain and trauma as raw material for his artistic expression. The defense is always historical context, but when the same obsessions appear across multiple films, spanning decades, we have to ask whether this is really about art or about something more personal and potentially disturbing. The most revealing moment in Quentin Tarantino's career came during a 2013 interview with British journalist Krishnan Guru Murthy. When pressed about violence in his films, Tarantino became visibly agitated, defensive, and almost panicked. "I'm not your slave, and you're not my master," he snapped, his composure completely shattered. For someone who claims his violence serves artistic purposes, his inability to discuss it rationally was telling.
But why are you so sure that there's no link between enjoying movie violence and enjoying real violence?
I'm going to tell you why I'm so sure. Do not ask me a question like that. I'm not biting. I refuse your question.
Why?
Because I refuse your question. I'm not your slave and you're not my master. You can't make me dance to your tune. I'm not a monkey.
I can't make you answer anything. I'm asking you interesting questions.
And I'm saying I refuse.
Okay. Well, no, I was just asking you why. That's fine. No, but you haven't fleshed it out.
It's not my job to flesh it out.
No, it's my job to try and ask you to.
And I'm shutting your butt down.
And that's entirely your. That's entirely
this
your.
This is a commercial
right.
from my movie.
No, I know, but it's my job to try and explore some serious themes as well.
I invite you to explore some serious things, but not things that I have already been on the record for.
This reaction was like someone whose core identity was being threatened. For most directors, their films are separate from their identity. For Tarantino, questioning his violence appears to be questioning his very self. And here's what makes the Tarantino phenomenon even more disturbing. He doesn't work alone. Some of Hollywood's most respected actors have willingly participated in his psychological expressions, lending their credibility to his obsessions. Samuel L. Jackson has appeared in 6 Tarantino films, delivering racial slurs and violent dialogue with enthusiasm. Uma Thurman spent years embodying his vision of beautiful female suffering. Jamie Foxx helped bring his slavery fantasies to life. These aren't struggling actors desperate for work. They're established stars who could choose any project they want. What does this say about Hollywood's moral compass when A-list performers line up to participate in increasingly disturbing projects? When Christoph Waltz won 2 Oscars for playing Tarantino's charismatic villains, the Academy was celebrating the artistic expression of someone else's psychological darkness. Consider how differently we'd react if these same obsessions appeared in someone's personal life rather than their professional work. If your neighbor spent 30 years creating elaborate scenarios involving torture, racial violence, and female suffering, you'd be concerned. But put it on a movie screen with proper lighting and a good soundtrack, and suddenly it's art. Tarantino's films have grossed over $1.5 billion worldwide, transforming his psychological obsessions into one of Hollywood's most profitable brands. But this success raises an uncomfortable question. What does it say about us that we've made brutality this lucrative? Every ticket sold for Kill Bill was a vote for elaborate revenge fantasies. Every download of Django Unchained was tacit approval of racial violence as entertainment. Every Academy Award given to his films was Hollywood's stamp of approval on the monetization of human suffering. The financial success has created a feedback loop that encourages Tarantino's worst impulses. Why would he examine his motivations when the market keeps rewarding them? Why would he seek help for potential psychological issues when those same issues generate hundreds of millions in revenue? But the money trail reveals something even more disturbing. Tarantino isn't just expressing his psychology through film. He's discovered that his particular brand of dysfunction is incredibly marketable. The same obsessions that might be concerning in a private citizen become lucrative intellectual property when properly packaged and distributed. We've turned Tarantino's expressions of violence and control into a business model that other filmmakers now emulate. His success has spawned an entire generation of directors who mistake brutality for depth, who confuse shock value with artistic merit. Perhaps most troubling is how Tarantino's psychological expressions have reshaped popular culture. Before Reservoir Dogs, torture scenes were rare in mainstream cinema. After his success, they became commonplace. He didn't just express his obsessions through film. He changed film culture to be more accommodating to psychological darkness. Young filmmakers now study Tarantino's work in film schools, learning to replicate his techniques without understanding the psychological underpinnings. We're teaching new generations of artists to see violence as stylish, trauma as raw material, and suffering as entertainment. The Tarantino effect extends beyond cinema into television, video games, and social media, where his aesthetic of beautiful brutality has become the standard for edgy content. His influence has normalized extreme violence as a legitimate form of artistic expression, regardless of the creator's motivations. But influence works both ways. The fact that Tarantino's particular psychological profile became so culturally significant suggests something troubling about our collective appetite for darkness. We embraced his obsessions, celebrated them, and made them central to contemporary entertainment. After examining 30 years of patterns, interviews, and cultural impact, the verdict becomes clear. Quentin Tarantino may not be a clinical psychopath, but his psychology is organized around violence, control, and the exploitation of trauma in ways that would be deeply concerning in any other context. His artistic gifts are undeniable. His dialogue is sharp. His narratives are innovative. His visual style is distinctive. But these talents appear inseparable from psychological obsessions that manifest in every frame of his work. The most honest assessment is that Tarantino represents something uniquely modern, the successful monetization of psychological dysfunction. In previous eras, someone with his particular obsessions might have been marginalized or sought help. In our era, they can become internationally celebrated artists, as long as their dysfunction produces marketable content. But the real question is about us. Why are we so eager to consume the products of a mind that appears genuinely fascinated by suffering? What does our enthusiasm for his work reveal about what we've become as a culture? The genius or psychopath debate misses the larger point. Tarantino may be both, but what's more significant is how our society has embraced the artistic products of his psychological landscape. We've made his obsessions our entertainment, transformed his fixations into cultural touchstones, and turned his apparent pathology into profit. As Tarantino approaches his promised retirement after 10 films, we're forced to confront the cultural legacy of someone whose art appears inseparable from psychological dysfunction. Future historians won't just analyze his technical contributions. They'll wonder what his success revealed about the society that embraced him. His influence on cinema is undeniable, but so is the disturbing precedent he set. That psychological darkness, when packaged with sufficient talent and style, can become not just acceptable, but celebrated. He's shown that audiences will not only tolerate, but actively seek out entertainment that reflects the filmmaker's personal obsessions with brutality and control. The most chilling aspect of his legacy may be how completely he's normalized his worldview. Violence as entertainment, trauma as art, suffering as spectacle, these concepts were controversial when Reservoir Dogs premiered. Now, they're standard elements of mainstream media, accepted without question by audiences who've been gradually conditioned to see them as normal. Tarantino transformed what might be pathology into prestige, and in doing so, he changed not just cinema, but culture itself. The next time you watch a Tarantino film, pay attention to your own reactions. Notice what excites you during the violent scenes. What makes you laugh at the brutality? What keeps you engaged despite the suffering on screen? Because understanding Tarantino's psychology may be less important than understanding our own complicity in celebrating it. We've spent 30 years rewarding someone whose artistic vision appears rooted in psychological darkness. We've made his obsessions profitable, his pathology prestigious, his dysfunction culturally significant. The question isn't whether Tarantino is a genius or a psychopath. It's what our enthusiastic support of his work says about us. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation isn't about Tarantino at all. It's about how eagerly we've consumed the products of his troubled psyche, how quickly we've normalized his worldview, and how successfully he's convinced us that his personal obsessions constitute high art. The genius of Quentin Tarantino may not be his filmmaking. It may be his ability to make us complicit in whatever darkness drives him to create. And if that's true, then the real question isn't about his psychology, it's about ours. What do you think? Have we been celebrating art or enabling pathology? Let me know in the comments, and if this analysis opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before. Subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology behind popular culture.